Welcome to a winter's day in New Zealand. How do you review stuff when the weather is like this? Fog, rain, mist, I don't know. Oh, Jumper sent me this. It's the Jumper T15. And I thought, how can I review this? Because everybody's reviewing it. You know, you don't want to see another boring review of a modern radio with all the bells and whistles and features. So I figured, let's make this a different kind of review. Let's make it cinematic, dramatic, and let's take a walk back through history. I'm going to compare this radio, the state-of-the-art Jumper T15 digital 2.4 gigahertz ELRS, to a radio, or the radio, I was using 20 years ago. That's right, back in 2004. I'll show you all about long wire and how this is so much different and so much better, yet in some ways, perhaps not quite so good. Let's get on with it.
Look, a new video from RC Model Reviews.
Let's go back 20 years to 2004. I was a much younger man back then, and the camera I used was far from HD, so excuse the quality of some of this footage. Now, in 2004, most people were flying long wire on 35, 36 or 72 megahertz. You could tell the long wire flyers because of the long shiny aerial that stuck out of the top of their radios. In fact, the flight line often looked more like a collection of recreational fishermen than model flyers. Way back then, one of the most common radios of the day was the JR9302, or 9X2 as it was known outside of the USA. This was a 9-channel long wire radio that sold for around $500 in 2004, which, adjusted for inflation, would be about 800 of today's Yankee dollars. So let's take a look at the features and limitations of this 20-year-old radio and compare it to a contemporary, state-of-the-art modern radio from Jumper. And here it is, the JR PCM 9X2, the radio from 2004, and it looks an awful lot like a Tyrannus, doesn't it? In fact, you can see where FrSky got their inspiration, although I think the Tyrannus case was originally a W-fly case and it's been used by 1001 other radio control manufacturers. But this is basically the radio. Now, I'll just step you through the little bits and pieces. It's got obviously 2 stick units, and by today's standards, these sticks are awful. They are awful. They just don't feel very good at all. So yeah, thank goodness we have modern sticks with Hall effect sensors and bearings. I think these probably just got plain old bushes in them. The trims, quite nice. They are clicky. They click when you move them, which is kind of nice. It has the little thumb wheel here for changing menu options and 4 buttons down here for selecting submenus and performing other operations, a bit like the modern radios. It has switches like all radios. It has 2 position, 2 position, 3 position, 2 position, and on the top we have 3 position, and that's a momentary contact one. That was used for training. That's your trainer switch. Over here, 2 position, 2 position. So not as many 3 position switches as a modern radio. We have these little clicky trims. These are like for non-proportional. They just add or minus to a channel, add or minus to a channel, simple as. I'm going to turn this on. Now this radio hasn't been turned on in probably 3 or 4 years. I use it in my yacht, which is about the only thing I'd use long wire on these days. And I haven't sailed my yacht in probably 3, 4, maybe 5 years. So let's turn this on and see if it actually works after all these years. Oh, loud beep, there you go. It's working. And the one thing you will immediately notice is the LCD. It is the crappiest LCD on any radio I have. I think when JR bought this radio, they went to the crap LCD factory and said, give me your worst product that we can use in this radio. And that's what they did. It's incredibly hard to see, very poor contrast, absolutely abysmal, considering that this was a pretty premium radio in its day. It wasn't just a cheapo radio, it was a pretty high quality radio. You also notice there's no backlighting. This has no backlighting whatsoever. It's just a transmissive or reflective LCD. Now if we turn this around, on the back you'll see in the module bay, this was a premium one because I have the synthesizer. This enabled the radio to synthesize all of the channels on 72 megahertz because these radios use individual channels, and this was the Achilles heel of the long wire system. You had to choose a channel and then make sure nobody else chose the same channel, because if two radios tried to operate on the same channel, they would interfere and you would crash. These days, you just turn your transmitter on, go fly. This is a bit like FPV is today. If you have two people trying to work on the same channel, disaster occurs. Had these little wee thumbnaily things here, you can twiddle backwards and forwards, little screwdriver things to set your channels, and away you go. And of course, on the top, we have the long wire antenna. This is really long, as you can see in the videos. It's a very long antenna, and it had to be up in order for the radio to give you operating range. All too often, people would forget to pull the antenna up before they took off, and within 100 yards or so, the model would come crashing to the ground because it would fly out of range. With a short antenna, with the antenna down like this, you had virtually no range. Well, maybe 30, 40, 50 meters at the maximum. So yeah, I forgot to mention, it does have sliders. Nice little sliders with a pretty good center detent. There's one thing that's missing from most modern radios, are good sliders with a center detent. These have got good range. So you've got, like, you know, plenty of movement, and that center detent is quite solid. Once it gets there, it wants to stick there. So that basically is the radio. Now the menus are awful. It's not intuitive. Trying to use the thing is horrible. If I was trying to program this today, it would take me hours to get some programming done because it's just it doesn't make sense. Because they had very small microprocessors, not a lot of memory, and so they had to squeeze a lot in, which meant not much room for the niceties of life. And they also had a real-time clock battery, and if that battery goes flat, then these radios tend to be bricked. Once that battery goes flat, they just simply give an error and they won't boot. So that's a real worry. But that's it. That is the JR9X PCM2, otherwise known as the 9302 in the USA, a $500 radio that by today's standards would cost you $800. And you don't get much for your money, do you? Right, let's jump forward 20 years thanks to my convenient time machine disguised as a 3D printer and take a look at the Jumper T15. It is now state-of-the-art entry to mid-level radio that costs a fraction of what that old JR radio cost. So let's have a look how it compares. What are the differences? What are the similarities? Well, here is the T15, and as you'll see, it's got sticks just like the JR radio. The difference is these sticks are so smooth. Oh, they feel gorgeous. One thing that I've always noticed with Jumper radios, they've never disappointed me in terms of the feel of the sticks. The sticks just feel gorgeous. Now, I've had Radio Masters with good sticks, but I've had Radio Masters with crappy sticks as well. But the Jumper radios just always seem to nail it when it comes to sticks. So if that's important to you, yeah, it's maybe a factor in your decision or your purchasing decision process. So yeah, bear that in mind. Now, I'm going to run through the switches on this radio just as I did with the JR. We've got 1, 3 position, 2, 3 positions, 4, 3 positions, 5. So, 4 3-position switches there. So that's a lot more than the JR. And of course, remember, you can always use a 3-position switch as a 2-position, but you can't to use a 2-position as a 3-position. But that's not where the switches end. There is a momentary contact push button switch up here, which you can use for like your beeper or something if you have that connected to your multi-rotor. And over here we have a latching switch. So that stays down or it comes up. ideal for arming with a multi-rotor situation, or even a fixed wing. Arming is great. You're not going to bump that switch because it's recessed, it's below the level of the transmitter, so you'll never accidentally arm your model, as you could do if you use this for arming, which is a lot more dangerous. Now, there is a scrolly wheel here, which is just like on the JR. There are 3 buttons there for helping with the menus and so forth, and there are another 2 buttons here, and these buttons illuminate when the radio is... Well, I'll tell you what, let's turn the radio on, shall we? Let's turn it on, and we'll see how good the LCD is. Oh, there we go. For a start, it's colour. We have a colour LCD, which in lighting conditions like this is brilliant. I still prefer monochrome in direct sunlight, but even this colour screen in direct sunlight is a whole lot better than that crappy old JR LCD. So let me just lower the throttle. So yeah, these buttons light up, and as you press, these are mode buttons here. So as you can see, we've got 6 of them. So we can have 6 flight modes with our flight controller, and choose them by pressing the appropriate button. How cool is that? We have also our trims here. Now, on the JR radio, the old radios, the trims were down there and up here. But here we have a single joystick trim. I'm not sure how I like the single joystick trim setup. I mean, it has its pros and its cons, has its benefits and its drawbacks. I'm sort of on the fence with that. I'm on the fence, but that's how the trims are set up. You don't have separate trim levers. You have a dual axis trim switch there and a dual axis trim switch here. So that's your choice. Now we've got some little rotary dials here, and thumbs up to Jumper. These have a very good solid firm center detent. So if you're using them for something like flaps or air brakes or spoilers, and you want to have a center position that's a known position, then this is a great way because it really firmly latches in place. Fantastic. But you'll notice there are no sliders. No sliders, which means this is far more, in my opinion, far better suited for rotary wing and a multi-rotor than it is for fixed wing. I like to have sliders because I fly mode 1, which means I have to have both hands on the sticks at all times, because this is my aileron and my throttle, this is my rudder and my elevator. So if I take my thumb off this stick, I've lost my elevator and rudder. If I take my thumb off this stick, I've lost my ailerons until I get back. So twiddling a knob requires relinquishing control of one of the major axes of control. So yes, I should fly mode 2, shouldn't I? But I learned on mode 1, and my muscle memories are all set for mode 1. I'm not going to change at this stage in my life. Yeah, so that's pretty much it. What else have we got? Nothing to speak of. Let's have a look on the back, because everyone likes to see on the back. We've got the module bay, JR type module bay there. We've got a little foldable handle, which is quite handy because it also acts to prop the radio up if you are going to put it on the ground. There we go, keeps everything clear of the ground. And this top antenna here, it can also be used as a handle, which is kind of cool. The other benefit of these antennas is you can orient them in a vertical position, which is best for consistent operation at range, because the null points where the transmitter doesn't send anything are going to be directly above you and directly below you, where it doesn't really matter. I tell people not to fly with your antennas horizontal. It can produce undesirable results. And while we've got the radio down here, you can see it's got a USB-C connector, and it's got a 3.2 millimeter jack, or a 3 mil jack there. That's basically it. It takes, was it 21700s in the back? I think something like that. Lithium-ion batteries doesn't come with the batteries. You've got to provide your own. Batteries are not included. So that's something to remember. That's basically the radio. It's got these buttons on the top here. No, not buttons at all, actually. They're just little, I don't know what goes in there. There's little rubber. Maybe they had another handle that was supposed to go over there or something, but you know, maybe there was a handle that was supposed to fit up there, but it's just empty holes, I wonder about the plastic, actually, because if we look on the back, and in the back of this, I don't know if I can pick it up here, it says something like Camem? What's that all about? Camem on the battery cover? I don't know if you can see that. What's that all about? I have no idea. Oh, it does have a little fan. 1 watt ELRS. So the little fan will keep things cool inside. Although I'm always a bit skeptical about little fans because sometimes they get noisy and sometimes they don't work. Little fans are notoriously unreliable. So that's a feature. It could also be in the longer term a bit of a drawback. You may have to replace that. How many people have got FPV goggles where the fan's gone noisy or simply stopped working? Yeah, I think a few of us have those. Yeah, that is basically the radio. And let's just turn it off. I always like watching these things turn off. There we go. It's gone. Yeah, there's not much else I can say about it, except if you push this little rubber thing, it's kind of cool. Which leads me to tell you can get it in multiple colours. There are a number of colours. Choose the one you want. They sent me this manly pink one because I'm not afraid to express my feminine side. Anyway, that's that. Now, one other element I think, one thing I should mention also too is the battery in this lasts several hours. If you fully charge the batteries, they will last several hours. That old JR radio, you were lucky to get an hour of operation because the old JR radios used to transmit, I think, several hundred milliwatts of power. This is transmitting up to 1 watt, but it's dynamic. With the ELRS, you can set it dynamic. So when you're flying close, it may only be using 10 milliwatts, which is very little drain on the battery. Also, modern battery technology is miles ahead of the old batteries we had in the radios from 20 years ago. We were lucky with NICADs, we were lucky to get 600 milliampere hours. The batteries in here are 4,000 milliampere hours. So obviously, even if this was to draw more power, which it does with the LCD on, it's going to last a lot longer. So we would only get a maximum of about an hour's flying time in the old days because the NICAD batteries in the old long wire transmitters, they took 14 hours to charge. So you couldn't just recharge at the field because they weren't fast charge. You just had to take it home and plug it in overnight. So we didn't get the flying opportunities you get with modern radios where you can just bung it on a charger. Within an hour, it's fully charged. It's fantastic. So that is that. Now, one other thing I want to talk about before we finish this subject, comparing old with new, is receivers. This is a very popular receiver from the era. It is what was made in China by a company. It was rebranded by a lot of US companies and resold as their own. It is this, in this case, the Light Flight FM dual conversion FM receiver. It's pretty much standard. It's got a quality control sticker on it. Must have been good. That's it. That's the receiver. The thing, you'll notice it has a very long wire hanging off it. In fact, I've measured the antenna 40 inches long. That's over a meter in length. That's the long wire that has to be unfurled and out in the open so that it can pick up the signal from the transmitter. And that's because these are on 72 megahertz. And 72 megahertz has a much longer wavelength than 2.4 gigahertz. So when you compare 40 inches of that antenna with the tiny little antennas we have on our ELRS and other 2.4 gig receivers, it's obvious that this isn't really practical for your tiny whoop or quite a lot of today's modern and very small aircraft. Also, it's not very practical because of the size. Now, in and of itself, it's not that much bigger than an ELRS receiver. Let me turn it round and I'll put the ELRS receiver on the top. This is a PWM receiver, so it's got separate outputs for servos because we didn't have S-bus and all the other serial buses way back in the day. We only had servos. You plugged your servos into your receiver and that was it. So if we take the pins out of the equation, you can see that the receiver is about half, just over half, well, ELRS receiver is only half the size of the old long wire receiver, but the big difference is in the thickness. Look how thick that is. That's super, super thin. Apart from the pins, there's really nothing to the depth of that receiver because all the components on there are what we call surface mount. They mount directly on the surface of the circuit board, very low profile, very small, very lightweight. Whereas if we look at, in fact, I've got another receiver here, which is probably better to look at. Here is an FM something or other, FMS receiver, FMA receiver, FMA. This is another long wire receiver. You can see there's a lot of components here that stand up very high above the board. We've got some coils here. These are coils. Those are two coils. There's a crystal in there, and we've got a ceramic filter here. Another coil down here. So there's a lot of parts which stand very proud of the board, which means if you have an impact, boing, like this, all those parts want to tip over. They want to fall over. It puts a lot of stress on them. And these are soldered through the board. They don't sit on the surface of the board. They're soldered through the board. So it makes them very vulnerable. They're quite delicate. And also they're quite heavy. You know, metal cans, a lot heavier than the tiny, tiny little components we have on the modern receivers. So these receivers were quite fragile and quite susceptible to vibration. So we had to wrap them in foam rubber. So when we look at a difference of 50% in size, that's before you've wrapped this thing in foam rubber. You couldn't just Velcro this on the side of a nitro or a gas model because the vibration would kill it in next to no time. One of the reasons for that is because see the holes here, Why isn't it focusing? Focus. See these holes here? Those holes are for a crystal. I have another receiver, another one of these here with the crystal in place. And there you go. You can see the crystal. Now this is on channel 17. And as you can see there, that's 72.13 megahertz. And that's the precise frequency on which this receiver would be operating. So if you're operating on channel 18, it wouldn't interfere at all. Channel 16, no interference. Only channel 17 transmitters would talk to this receiver. And this is one of the great things. And you know, I mentioned perhaps that in some ways long wire was better than modern 2.4. Well, one of the ways it is better is you could just go and buy this receiver, plug the right crystal in and use it. You didn't have to bind it to anything. You didn't have to make sure that the firmware was updated to the same version as your transmitter. In that respect, you didn't need a soldering iron. It was just plug and play. And there was no need for all the stuff we get into now. No firmware versions. Basically, there was no way to update the firmware on this. These did have a little microcomputer in them because they tried to introduce some interference rejection. But most of these receivers were what we call pretty dumb. And there's no firmware to be updated in them. So you bought them and you used them. It was as simple as that. These days, you know, this is on ELRS 2 point something. If I want to use it with the new Jumper T15 transmitter, I have to update it to ELRS 3 point something because version 2, version 3, they don't talk so well together. Yet this receiver here could be used with FM transmitters made by JR or Futaba or anybody right from 15 years ago up till the year this was made. There was no version troubles whatsoever. And thinking back, the FM era, the old long wire radios, if you were using FM as opposed to PCM, there was a huge level of compatibility. As I say, these receivers would work with virtually any FM transmitter on the market at the time, which is brilliant. Well, these days you've got to make sure that if you've got a Free Sky Protocol transmitter, you buy a Free Sky Protocol receiver. And if you've got ELRS, you buy an ELRS receiver, and then you make sure they're all in the same version of software. It can be a bit of a nightmare for people who are not particularly computer literate and don't want to spend time playing with a computer. They just want to go flying. So things in that respect have got a lot more complicated. With the added power of modern systems comes complexity. Now, as I mentioned, these have a crystal, replaceable crystal in them, so you can change the channel. If you go to the flying field and your channel was, say you went through there and there were 5 other people on channel 17, well, you could pull that channel 17 crystal out, put in a channel 20 or 30 or whatever, I don't know if we went to about 30, but up to 20 or 25, whatever, change the channel number, and then you could fly as long as no one else was on those other channels. And at most smaller flying fields, you could find a channel where there were no other people there, so you could just go and fly, but you still had to check every time, just in case a stranger had rolled up or someone else had changed their frequency. In fact, we had a thing called a peg board back then, where you would have to select a peg from that board. Every frequency, every channel had its own little peg on a board, and you were not allowed to turn your transmitter on until you'd taken the peg for that channel and attached it to your transmitter, so that that peg was basically your key to use the frequency. If you didn't have the peg, you couldn't turn your transmitter on. When you'd finish flying, you take the peg off, you turn transmitter off, take the peg off, put it back on the board, someone else could use it, someone else could use the frequency. System worked very, very well for a very, very long period of time. But now I mentioned that my JR radio had a synthesized transmitter, so I didn't have to change crystals in the transmitter module. I could just flick some little switches and change to any of the channels. And surprisingly enough, well, not surprising I suppose, towards the end of the FM era, the long wire era, we had receivers like this. This is a Seeker 8 from Polk's Hobby, which is an American company, 72 megahertz again, and but it's a synthesized receiver. This receiver, you plugged a little button in, you press the button down, and it would hunt around to find your transmitter, and it would lock onto that frequency. These were quite good when they worked, but sometimes they didn't work that well. But again, look at the huge metal can here. These things were quite sensitive to vibration and impact, so you had to wrap them in another inch of foam, so they ended up getting an awfully lot bigger than the little modern receivers of today, especially when you look at the thickness, massive difference in thickness. So if you're using a modern ELRS receiver with a flight controller, you won't have these pins here, so it's just the size of it's as thick as a credit card. Velcro to the side of the fuselage, because we're using electric now instead of nitro, no vibration to worry about. Brilliant, so much better. But this is what we had, this is what we worked with, and we were happy. Especially with the synthesized receiver, it means we could go to the flying field, find an empty channel, set our transmitter and our receiver to that channel, and fly all day without having to worry about conflicting with anybody else. But these days, with 2.4, you do that anyway, because the systems automatically take care of making sure you're not going to interfere with someone else in the air. There's so much space. And in the 72 megahertz band, I think we had 1/4 megahertz or something maybe to play with, maybe 1/2 megahertz to play with in terms of the total bandwidth. When we go to 2.4, we've got 83 megahertz, I think, to play with. So there's so much more room there. There's no chance of anyone stamping or stomping on anybody else's signal. So that's the receivers. These are the things we used back in the day. Not that one, but these ones. And yeah, and they were quite expensive too compared to modern ELRS receivers. So, bottom line, would I recommend this radio? Well, if you've already got a radio, I don't see any point in upgrading to this because it's no better than the previous Jumper radios and many of the other radios on the market. But if you do need a new radio, well, it's something worth giving a look at because it is fully functional. It's got everything you need. Unless you want to fly fixed wing and you want sliders, this will do the job very nicely indeed. 1 watt ELRS, EdgeTX, easy to program, very ergonomic, and the sticks are lovely. Okay, so yeah, I'd say definitely worth a look. And besides, this just never grows old. Thanks for watching, folks. And don't forget, more reviews coming on RC Model Reviews. Thank you to my Patreon supporters. And I'll see you in the next video. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.